So my meeting plan was to just tell you a little bit about how I first became aware of Mike and his work. And I'll turn the meeting over to him to introduce himself, where he is now, talk about what his experience with Access and SQL Server and so on, and then go into his presentation. I first became aware of Mike on Twitter of all places. And I ran across a Twitter, somebody had tweeted his blog, which is NoLongerSet.com. And when I read that, I thought, here's somebody who's not only technically knowledgeable, but concise and articulate. And those three together do not necessarily characterize most software developers. So I was very impressed right off the bat, and I wanted to check out the rest of his work. And then when Juan asked me to start this group out here on the West Coast, I immediately thought of Mike as a presenter. So he graciously agreed to get us off the ground. This is actually the first formal presenter-led meeting, so looking forward to hearing what you have to say with continuous forms. And I'll turn the time over to you to tell us about yourself and background a little bit, or whatever you need to say, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, George. And I want to, before I get started, I just want to thank you for volunteering your time to get this new Pacific Access user group up and running. As you mentioned, my talk today is on navigating continuous forms using WithEvents. And we're going to talk about how to enable Excel-like arrow key navigation. And by the time we get to the end, we'll be able to do that with just 2 lines of code. So I'd like to also thank George for giving me the opportunity to present you with today's topic. As he said, my name is Mike Wolfe, and I write daily articles about Access and VBA at NoLongerSet.com. And here's just a quick summary of my background. I graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 2002 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Computer Science. I then served as an officer in the U.S. Army Signal Corps until 2007. I've been developing Microsoft Access applications now for the past 14 years. And for the last 5 years, I've owned and operated the same small software development company that I first started working for when I left the Army. Now, Access and VBA get a bad rap in software development circles as a quote-unquote toy language that real software developers would never use. Well, I'm here to show you that there's a lot more to Access and VBA than meets the eye. And my goal is for you to leave here at the end of this presentation armed with some new techniques that you can use to build better Access applications. And because the only way we're going to improve Access's reputation is by using it to build great software. Right, so here's what I'm going to cover tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. If you're new to Access development, don't worry, I'm going to take you through the whole journey, one step at a time. And if you're an advanced Access developer, I'm going to be sprinkling in some ideas and concepts that you might not be using yet. So I guarantee that everyone here will leave with at least one new tip or trick unrelated to the main topic of this talk that you can start using right away. So here's the outline. We're going to start out by defining the problem. In the first part, we're going to go through a proof of concept. And then we're going to take that proof of concept, we're going to extract that out into a standalone routine. We're going to take that standalone routine and move that into a class module integrated with using the WithEvents keyword. And to finish things up, we're going to encapsulate all of that functionality into a standalone class module that we can call from our other continuous forms using only 2 lines of code. Okay, so what's the problem exactly? So the problem is that continuous forms in Access, if you've set them up with a single line in the detail section, look an awful lot like an Excel worksheet. You have a grid-like set of text boxes, and so you would expect that you'd be able to use the up and down and the left and right arrows to be able to move from one text box to another. The problem, though, is that by default, the behavior in Access is that the up and down arrows move left and right. They move to the previous or the next control as opposed to moving to the previous or the next record. So let's just do a quick demo to demonstrate what that problem is. Okay, so I've got a continuous form that I built, and I imported some data from the Northwind sample database, and I'm just going to drag over an on-screen keyboard here to help demonstrate the problem. Okay, so if we come up here, we go left and right. This is the way we would expect it to work. This is just the way it works in Excel. But now when we go down, we would expect that we're going to come down to this Cajun seasoning cell. But that's not what happens. Instead, we go to the next control over to the right. And if we try and go up, and we would expect this to go to the $18 list price, and instead it goes to the previous control. Okay. All right, so now that we've defined the problem, let's start out by just a quick proof of concept. So as part of this proof of concept, I'm going to show you how to handle the KeyDown event for a given control. I show you a technique that I refer to as a guard clause. Then we'll override the default behavior by moving to the previous or next record set. And another technique that I use to to override the default behavior completely. And then finally, the last part of the proof of concept is going to be handling the beginning of file and the end of file and forms that allow additions. So let's jump back over to our form. Okay, so we're going to go into design view here. And to start, we're just going to implement the KeyDown event for a single text box. So we can double click on the event tab, the property sheet for that text box. And then if we click on the ellipsis over here, it's going to jump us right into our VBA editor. And this is just a standard VBA editor. I changed the colors around a little bit. We've got the KeyDown event. Now there's 3 different keyboard events. There's a KeyDown, there's a KeyUp, and there's a KeyPress event. We're only concerned about the KeyDown event. If you're curious about the other events, I've got at the end of this slideshow, I'm going to have a link to an article that I wrote on NoLongerSet.com that's going to have links to previous articles that I've written about some of these topics. So as I go through the presentation today, I may mention that if you want to check out more information about it, that you can go to that blog page, and I've got a bunch of links to articles that I've already written. Okay. So the first step on here is we're going to write what I refer to as a guard clause. Okay. So this shift argument is actually a bitmask. And if you're not familiar with what a bitmask is, there's actually 3 different Booleans that are built into this, this argument. So this shift argument can have a value from 0 to 7, and depending on which keys the user is holding down, determines what the value of this shift argument is. So if they're holding down Shift and Alt, then the shift argument is going to have a value of 5, 1 plus 4. If they're holding down all 3 keys, it's going to have a value of 7. So what this guard clause is doing, and guard clauses in general, are just simple expressions that you can put at the top of your procedures to check for invalid conditions. So in this case, if the user is holding down any of the modifier keys, then we want to just exit the routine immediately. Now we could do this the other way, and we could say that if shift equals 0, then do something. But now we've got an extra of indenting, and then we've got an extra end if that we need to keep track of. And the more indenting you have, the harder it is to read your code and follow it. So again, that's the technique that I like to use whenever possible. And ideally, I like to have try and put these on a single line. And so if you go into a routine, you might have 3 or 4 different guard clauses at the top to validate the state of your program before you go through your routine. Okay, so now we want to actually override that default behavior. So to do that, we're going to create a select case statement, and we're going to look at the key code. So the other argument that comes in is the key code, and that's the main key that the user has pressed down. So we use these vbKeyCode constants, vbKeyUp and vbKeyDown, instead of using the actual integer values, which again makes the code a lot more readable. So the basic idea is that when the user presses the up arrow key, that what we want to do is we want to move to the previous record. When they press the down arrow key on their keyboard, we want to move to the next record. Okay, now that's all well and good. The problem that we run into is that this additional behavior that we do here doesn't change the fact that they've still pressed this up and down arrow key. And so if we don't do anything to override this value, then it's going to fall through when this event code finishes, and whatever the original behavior was for the up and down arrow keys is going to play out on the form. So what we want to do is we want to set that key code equal to 0. So we could do that here. We could say set key code equal to 0, and we could say set key code equal to 0 here. But if we decide later on that we want to handle additional keys, then we need to remember to put that code in each one of our additional case statements. So what I prefer to do is to actually put that key code line before the select case statement. Okay, so we're going to disable the key's default behavior. Of course, the problem here is if we're going to set this key code to 0, we can't use that in our select case statement. So before we set that to 0, we're going to save that value in a local variable. So we've got the save key code variable. We're going to save the value of the key code in here. Then we're going to set the key code to 0. And then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to restore the original behavior for any keys that we don't handle. So any other character that if we don't have this line in here, then they won't be able to write anything in the in that text box. Any character that comes through, it'll lose all of its functionality. So the last step in this case is we just restore the default behavior to the unhandled keys. Okay, so let's jump back over to our form now and see what kind of progress we've made. We'll bring our on-screen keyboard back. Okay. What did I forget? This is what I forgot to do. Forgot to do this. So I mentioned that we needed to do the select case on something other than key code, and then I forgot to change it. Okay, that's better. So again, we've only done this in the product code text box. So if we come over here, this behavior isn't working yet, but it's working here now. Okay, so we've handled the simple case, but what about the beginning and the end? So if we go to the beginning of the file, and I want to point out here that I want you to watch how many times I click the up arrow. So the first time I click the up arrow, it goes to the top row. And now I'm at the top row and I click it one time and nothing happens. When I click it the second time, now I get this error saying that there's no current record. So the reason I'm getting this no current record error is because I'm now at the beginning of the file. So I'm at the beginning of the record set, and if I try and move to the previous record, there's no record there. And so that's why we get the error message. Now, the same thing's going to happen at the bottom. If we go down to the bottom and we press the down arrow key, then we're also going to get an error once we get to the end of file. Now, something I want to point out about the beginning of file and the end of file properties is that they actually occur before the first and after the last record in the record set. So what we're going to do is, if we're at the beginning of the file, I'm just going to jump here, then again, we've moved to the record that's before the first record. So we're just going to move back to the first record. So if we're starting at the beginning of the file and we move to the next record, that's actually the first record in our record set. And of course, we're going to need to do the same thing with the key down. If we get to the end of the record, end of the file there, then we want to move to the previous record. So let's jump back to our form and make sure that that's working the way we expect. Okay. And now we can press up as many times as we want, and it immediately goes back down. And then if we go to the bottom of our form, apologize. So one step ahead of myself there. Okay, so we're at the bottom of the form, and we can go down and nothing happens. So we've got most of the basic functionality in place. And then the next step, though, is we want to handle the forms that allow additions. So now if we are allowing additions, we've got an extra record at the bottom. So what's going to happen when we try and go down to that extra record? It's not ever going to get there. So we press up, we go down, and it's not getting there because we're at the end of file. So we need to add some extra handling when we're doing the key down and we get to, and we have allow additions turned on. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to replace this whole line here. And so now what we're going to do when we get to the end of the file, we're going to check to see whether allow additions has been turned on. And if it is enabled, then we're going to go to that new record. And if it's not, then we're going to move to the previous record. Now, the other thing that we need to do is we need to account for the possibility that we're already at the new record. And in that case, if we're already at a new record, then when the user presses the down arrow key, we just want to exit the sub. We don't want it to do anything at all. If they're already on the new record, there's nowhere else to go. So we're just going to exit immediately. Okay, so this is going to get us most of the way there. We've got one last problem that we need to account for. Okay, so let's just demonstrate this. Okay, so that works great. But what if we're at this record up here, and then the user jumps down here with the mouse? When they press the up arrow, we would expect that it would go to this 99 record, but instead the record set is still stuck at this cursor up here. So we need to do something to deal with that. So let's do that now. Okay, so now if we're already at the new record and they press the up arrow key, we're going to move to the last record in the record set, and then we're going to exit the sub. Down here, and now when we go up, it takes us right to where we want to go. Okay, so that's basically the functionality. So we've gone through and we've that's our proof of concept. We've been able to kind of handle all the different situations, and we're responding to the up and down arrow keys. But right now, everything is stuck in that one key down event. Okay, so let's improve on that. So the next step to improve on that is to take that code and extract it out into a standalone subroutine. And then again, to follow the progression, we're going to call that subroutine from each control on the form. I'll show you the demonstration to prove that it's still working, and then show you what might be considered a little bit of a controversial approach to improving the code readability. So let's jump back over to our code and let's open up part 2. Okay. So we're going to go back to our product code. And we're going to copy and paste the contents of that KeyDown event into a new private routine. So we're going to call it ArrowKeyNav. Just going to cut and paste that code in there. Right now we're just, we've got the same KeyCode and Shift arguments in there. And the one thing I want to point out here is that in my definition of the ArrowKeyNav routine, I'm using the ByRef keyword. Now this is entirely optional. If you don't use either ByRef or ByVal, every argument in VBA is passed by reference by default. So we're not actually changing the behavior in any way. My own personal preference is that I like to use this ByRef keyword if I'm explicitly planning on changing the value of the argument that's being passed in. So if I'm going to take advantage of the fact that it's being passed by reference and I'm going to make changes to that argument, then I like to put the ByRef keyword there just to indicate that that's what I'm doing. Other people use some kind of a naming convention to indicate that it's going to be coming out or maybe InOut. Again, if I think whatever your convention is, you should have some way to indicate if you are planning on making changes to a variable, to an argument that you want to have effect within the calling code. Okay. So now that we've extracted that out into its own procedure, now we need to call it from each control. So we've got it in the product code text box. Let's go back here and we're going to call it from each one of these other controls. So first thing I did is I used held down the Shift key so that I can select multiple controls and then I can set the event procedure for all of them at once. Unfortunately, there's no way to generate the code for all of them at once, so we have to do that individually. So I'm just going to move this around here quick and generate that one, generate that one there, and then our last two, we've got a checkbox and a combo box. Okay. And let's pull this guy up here. And we're just going to copy and paste that line of code. To each of the other controls on the form. All right, so now let's switch back. Let's just prove that it's going to work. All right, and as you can see, even on the checkboxes and on the combo boxes, it's working the way we'd expect. All right, now that's an awful lot of boilerplate code, and if we come in and we look at this, we've got the routine that's actually doing something down here, and then we've got all these other routines up here. And to just glance at this, it's not obvious that these are all doing the exact same thing. The technique that might be a little bit controversial, but what I like to do then is use the colon character to combine these different code statements onto a single line. Okay, so when I'm done with this, I'm going to show you, we're going to do some, adjust the white space a little bit as well, so that these all line up. And what I like about this format is that you can look at this at a glance and see that this big block of code here, which before stretched, so it didn't even fit all on the screen, these are all doing the exact same thing. So from my point of view, this is more readable than what we had before. You need to be a little bit careful with this combining lines using the colon character. You can, I mean, if you really wanted to obfuscate your code, we could just like take this whole routine and put it on a single line, and until you run out of I think VBA has some kind of a maximum character limit on each line. But if you use it judiciously, I think you can really increase the readability of your code. So that's nice, but we still have a lot more. We're still copying and pasting all of these calls. So there's got to be a better way than that. So let's move on to where we're starting to get into some of the more advanced topics here. And that's by moving that routine into a standalone class module. And we're going to start by creating what I refer to as a listener class. This is going to be a class module that's going to listen for and handle events raised by other objects. So we're going to integrate the ArrowKeyNav routine into this class. Then we're going to call that class from our form. And finally, we're going to handle the combo boxes and checkboxes. So when we start out, we're just going to handle the text boxes at first. Okay, so let's go back to our demonstration database. Okay, and when we jump into design view, so that looks pretty much like where we left off. So let's start by creating a new class module. And I've got one left over from before, so I'm just going to rename that so we can step through the creation process and follow along from start to finish. Okay, so we're going to rename that class module to weArrowKeyControl, and that might be a little bit small to read on there, but the reason I'm using this, I use the WE as a naming convention for any of my class modules that have that are primarily based around using the WithEvents command. So unfortunately, Access and VBA doesn't have any way to group these things. There's you can use the RubberDuck VBA extension, which will allow you to group some of your modules. For me, I have a lot of large Access applications, and I find the RubberDuck project itself is a little bit on the heavyweight side, and so I've tried it a couple times in the past, but it's not for me. But that's one of the nice features that you have to be able to group those things. Okay. So we've got our ArrowKeyControl WithEvents class. So we're going to start out by creating a class level module or a module level variable that's a text box. Okay, so I've got the M in front of there, naming convention, just to show that it's a module level variable. And right now, if we look in the object dropdown, the only object that we have access to is the class itself. Now, if we throw the WithEvents keyword in front of our text box variable, now we see it pops in here. We have the option to choose that. And when we choose it, I choose the right one, then it creates a skeleton of the default property for that object, the default event, which apparently is before update. That's not the one that we want, so we're going to switch to the KeyDown event, and we can get rid of that code. Okay, so at this point, we've got the object that we're going to be listening for events on. Now we need to actually do something within that KeyDown event. So let's go back to our form and let's grab that ArrowKeyNav code and we're going to put it in here. Okay. So the one thing that we were able to do when we had this in the code behind the form, we were able to refer to the form object itself by using the reserved name me. This isn't going to work in here because me dot, it's no longer referring to a form, it's now referring to this new class object. So what we need to do is we need to pass the form object in there. So we're going to add a new parameter and we're going to do a find and replace. Okay, and now we should be able to call that from our KeyDown event. And there's a couple different ways that we can get the form object in here, but 95% of the time we can just refer to the parent of the text box control. Most of the time that's going to be the form object. There are some edge cases where the text box parent might be something else. But for our purposes, to simplify things, we're just going to refer to the parent of the text box object, and that's going to get passed in here. Okay, so let's go back to the form. And let me see, I've got, I skipped over a step here. Okay, so we've got this text box here, but we've got no way to link it to the text box on the calling form. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a read-only property. Sorry, a write-only property. So this is the rare write-only property, and we don't have any reason to reference this text box once we put it in here. So rather than fill up our code with an unnecessary property get, we're just going to use this property set procedure to set pass in the text box from the form, and we're going to assign that text box coming from the form to our module level text box variable up here. And now this extra line here where we're setting the onKeyDown property to event procedure, this isn't strictly necessary. We could be doing this on the form by specifying this explicitly, but that's one more thing that we have to remember to do. So by putting it in here, we can ensure that it's going to get set. If we don't have this in here and we don't set the onKeyDown property of the text box on the form, then this event is never going to get raised. So just simplifies our life in the future. Okay, so let's go back here. Let's add an event procedure for the form load event. Okay, so here's where we're going to integrate we're going to call that new class module from the form itself. So let's just start by getting rid of all that existing code. And then we're going to declare some module level variables. Now we have to do these at the module level so that they stay in scope. Otherwise, as soon as, if we were to declare these as local variables inside the form load event, then as soon as the form load event went out of scope, as soon as it exited here, then all of these object variables would go out of scope and the code wouldn't work. So that's why we have it up here at the module level. Okay, so now we're going to call those. And so now we're using that write-only property, that text box, and we're using the set keyword. So we're setting the text box ID, the text box list price. So these are all the text boxes from our form, and we're assigning those to the text box in our WithEvents class module. Okay, so we've done enough. Let's switch back here to make sure that this is actually going to work. Bring our on-screen keyboard back. Okay, and everything is still working until we get over here to the checkboxes, right? So the checkbox and the combo box aren't working, and that's because we haven't handled those yet. So let's go handle those. Okay, so let's go back to the ArrowKeyControl. We're going to add a couple lines to the header. So we're going to need two additional objects up here. We're going to need a combo box and a checkbox. Let's put those in. Okay, now we could do another write-only property for the combo box and then a third write-only property for the checkbox, but that seems excessive. So instead, we're going to do a single write-only property for a generic control. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use that control, the control type property of the control, to assign it to the appropriate module level variable up here. So if it's a text box, we're going to assign it to our text box variable, combo box, checkbox, etc. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to add a little bit of defensive programming. If we try and assign some other control type that we haven't supported yet, we want that to raise an error. So we're going to throw in a case else down here, and we're going to throw an error. And chances are this is going to happen. Let's see, there we go. This error is going to get thrown while we're in development mode, most likely. Hopefully you're at least stepping through your forms to make sure that they work. And if not, they'll get thrown the first time you have a user that uses it. Now, this is one of those extra tips that I was talking about that I was going to sprinkle in throughout the presentation. So throw is not something that's built into VBA. This is a public routine that I make that's part of my error module, and I use this, and it integrates really well. This concept integrates really well with VB Watchdog, and as you'll notice throughout, I'm not adding any error handling in here. This is actually what my real production code looks like for the most part, because I use VB Watchdog, which takes care of all those error handling things and saves from just cluttering up my code base with a whole bunch of error handling boilerplate code. So if you're not using VB Watchdog, I can't recommend it enough. You can do some really pretty incredible things having that global error handler, and it's so nice. I can't tell you how nice it is to be able to just go through and rip out a whole bunch of boilerplate error handling code and not have to worry about your application hard crashing when some user's using it in a runtime environment. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put that, set that on key down for all those, and now we don't need this anymore. We just have to go back to our form, and we have to change these to control. And then we also need our discontinued. And our supplier ID. Set those here. Okay, so let's jump back to our form. And I'm just going to use the keys on the keyboard. So I'm pressing up and down, left and right. And it's not working. Let's just jump in here real quick. And if this doesn't work, we can step through. We're going to step over these and go in here. And let's reload the form. Okay, so I'm apologize. I'm missing something there. But we're gonna keep going because that's not the final code anyway. What we're gonna be getting to now is the actual production version of the class module that I use, and I'm gonna show you some of the finishing touches that are in there. So one of the things that is gonna be in there is some special handling for combo boxes that are open, and I'll show you why that's a problem. We're also going to look at how we can make this completely self-contained without having to call a separate assign an object for each one of those objects in our form. And then finally, how we can implement the whole thing with only 2 lines of code. Okay, so let's and this demo's gonna cooperate with me. Okay, so one of the issues that we have do it here. Nope. All right. Unfortunately, I'm not able to demonstrate the problem, but one of the issues that we have with the code that we've written to this point is that the way I have it written, it doesn't take into account the possibility that the combo box is open. So if I press the up and down arrow keys while the combo box is open, what it would be doing is it would be jumping up to the previous record instead of navigating within the opened combo box. So let me jump back here, and I'm going to go to, this is my actual production class module, and this entire database is available as a sample database from my website, NoLongerSet.com. It's on there with as today's article. And there's also going to be a link directly to the article at the end of this presentation. So you'll be able to see that if you're watching the video, and you'll be able to find it that way. So we've got the WithEvents, the module level variables up here. And then what we have is this control collection, this private control collection. So what this allows us to do is, instead of having to assign each individual control the way we have to this point, we can call just a single function. Where is it? Full arrow key navigation. So it's going to go in, it initializes the collection, and then it goes through the detail section, goes through each of the controls in there. And if it's one of those types, if it's a text box, a combo box, or a checkbox, it looks to see whether that control is enabled and visible. And if it is, then it sets a new, we've got this local nav control object within this local routine. So it assigns that. But if we were to stop there, then this is going to scope as soon as we leave our routine. So we take that object that we've just created and we add it to a collection, this internal control collection here. And so that once we do this initial setup, all of those controls remain in scope within the collection. And then at the end of the, when the class shuts down, then it goes through and it empties out that collection. So we've got one other thing in here, is the KeyDown for a combo box is different than the checkbox and the text box. We've got this extra check in here now to see whether or not the combo is open. And so this code I cannot take credit for. This is from Dev Ashish, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. But if you're not already familiar with some of Dev's work, I've gotten an awful lot of my API code from the old access.mvps.org website, and this is, you know, I did make some minor modifications. These the original code was written prior to VBA 7 and 64-bit access, so I went through and updated it so that it runs under 64-bit access. So this is 64-bit friendly. So let's go back to our final. So this is the ultimate solution here. So this is the final form, and this is all you have to do now to completely override the default behavior of the continuous form. In the load event, you load it up, you have a module level private variable that's of this class type, and then you call that one method, full arrow key navigation, pass it the form object, and it goes through, loops through all those, the controls within the detail section, and it overrides the behavior. So now if we go back and we open up part 5, yes, just to do one final proof so that I can end on a high note. We can see that this all works. And if the combo boxes drop down, it's down. Okay, so with that, I believe that takes us to the end of the presentation. There are those 2 final lines of code with that ArrowKeyNav class module. This is all you need to completely change the behavior so that your continuous forms act like the Excel user interface that people are used to. So at this point, if anybody's got any questions, that's the website here, NoLongerSet.com. And if you just go to NoLongerSet.com right now, it's going to be the first article there. If you're watching a replay of this, you should be able to get there by putting in that full URL.
Okay, while you were doing your presentation, I put links to the 3 articles that I saw in reference to this in the chat, so that people can read that. But that was outstanding. I appreciate the effort. It's not often the case that we get through a full presentation in the allotted time, so A+ on that side too. So does anybody have any questions or comments? I think that my next step, not tomorrow I've got something else, but probably Saturday, I'm going to see about implementing this. To be honest with you, when I first went and looked at your articles, I thought, you know what? I'll wait till the presentation to see what all this is all about before I attempt it, because it's not something I've done before. But now that I see the concept, I'm going to make an effort to implement it, at least one of my personal databases.
Mm-hmm.
So does anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Mike, as I mentioned before, when you're passing the form object, I noticed there you use Me.Form.
Right.
If you just use Me, is that the same because the form property is the default, or is there a slight difference?
I believe it's the same. I think I've even done it both ways. Feel like I'm not always in the habit of doing it, but being explicit about using the default property instead of just relying on Access to do that implicit coercion to the default object is, it can save you sometimes. I've gotten into trouble in the past, but I'll admit I don't always use, for instance, the dot value when I'm referring to bound text boxes and that kind of thing. I'll rely on that, the implicit use of the default value. So there's not really any difference. It does save you a little bit, other than, as I pointed out there, if you copy that code and you put it somewhere else, then the me is going to refer to a different object. So you might not, if you've got Me.Form, you might be more likely to catch that error at compile time as opposed to at runtime, not just in this specific situation, but just in general.
Yeah,
I just had a recollection that Anders, with, I think it was his refresh and reposition in a continuous form procedure, that he said that it was important to use form rather than just Me. I can't find the reference to it at the moment, but
yeah, so it could be, so Me is probably referring to the specific object itself, so the specific form. Whereas if you say Me.Form, it's referring to the generic form. So the difference being that if you've got public properties on your specific form, those things are going to come along if you pass it just plain Me, it's going to be an instance of that form. And I'm guessing that however Anders was doing it, that maybe that's the distinction why that mattered there. I don't think it matters in this case, but it's the sort of thing that can lead to
I
hard
have
to find bugs.
I like to say that the ambiguity is great in poetry, politics, and humor, but it's not so good in databases.
Yeah.
I much prefer the explicit.
well, you know, in the class that I've been using, I actually go to a form first, and then the form has a collection of all the objects. You've seen that,
Right.
Mike, but I've been passing it just Me, and it's been working just fine for years.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I can understand why in this case it doesn't work. But if you'll notice that sometimes you lose those objects, and as you saw, your up and down arrow doesn't work if you've been playing with the code behind. And so when you're declaring those objects at the module level, then they can be lost if you start changing code in behind. And that's why you've got to refresh the form.
Yeah, you're talking about resetting the code itself. You know, if you're in form view and then you start making changes to the code while it's in there and you end up resetting the code. Is that what you're talking about, or something else?
No, if you make changes to the code while you're in form view, not design view.
Right.
Yeah. And you can lose that. And is there any slight difference between loading them in the load event as opposed to the open event?
There is a difference, and in some cases it makes a difference. I think I usually put it in the form load event. Obviously, there's differences in the event itself. In the open event, you have the option of canceling, and one happens before I believe the open event. I'd have to double check the order that they happen in. There are certain things that have to go in one or the other. In my own notes, I've got that I call it from the load event, and so that's probably how I've done it most of the time, and it seems to work.
Yeah, the load event I think happens after the open event, and I had to recently. I was having trouble with the application crazy in 64-bit access, and that was I worked out due to conditional formatting, and so I moved the loading of the conditional formatting into the load event rather than having it saved with the form, and that seemed to resolve the issue. So I could probably actually move that conditional formatting into one of these control classes with events control class. Yep.
Yeah, I've had some issues with conditional formatting in the past, and specifically, I think in trying to change the conditional format, editing the conditional format formula, and what I found was it was more reliable, at least in older versions of Access, to delete the conditional format and re-add it each time, as opposed to editing it in place. I don't know if that's gotten cleaned up in the newer versions of Access, but the codes, I just use what's always worked for me.
Well, it certainly seems to be an issue in 64-bit version of Access, but I don't think it's an issue in the 32-bit version.
Okay. So let's wrap this up. We're right at an hour. I want to again thank Mike for taking time. I know you've been very busy in the last couple of weeks, so I appreciate the effort to be here tonight. A couple of housekeeping and business related things. I did send out a reminder this morning, according to my outbox. I sent out a reminder, but only 3 people actually read it. So apparently it was not very effective. And so what I'm going to ask is that if you want to get that email, I'm going to put my email address in the chat and ask you to please let me know that you would like to be on the mailing list for future meetings, so I make sure that I let you know. Did that go through? Yeah. No, that's an app. I'm sorry. I should never try to talk and type at the same time.
Yeah, I learned that when I was rehearsing this. So I was using auto hotkey in the background to write all that code out until I got to the very end. There were a couple spots that I apparently missed, and you probably noticed that the quality of my talking and typing fell off there at the very end.
No, well, actually, I thought
I can't even
put together, considering the time frame there. So the other thing I'd like to mention is, if you have any suggestions for topics for future meetings, let me know either through the website or directly at my email there. I've been negotiating with Albert Kalau to do a presentation on SharePoint. And I think that's going to happen pretty soon. Now, I don't, those of you who know Albert, if there's a question about SharePoint that he can't answer, can't be answered. So I'm looking forward to getting him with us. And if you have any other topics that you'd like, I know a lot of people. I don't know a lot myself, but I certainly do know the people who do know. So if there's something you'd like to see, I'd be happy to reach out and find somebody to talk about it. And of course, I'm going to invite Mike back sometime later, maybe towards the end of the summer when Twin Basic gets a little more solidified, to talk about that again if you have any interest in doing that. And I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, but just put the button in here. That would be nice.
Yeah, I got Armin invited me to that Cascade conference in, well, either virtually or maybe they'll have it in Oregon. So I don't have a topic for that yet. I was actually thinking about maybe a follow-up to Twin Basic, because there were a lot of concern in the chat of how does this actually affect us in the Access world, and hopefully by then, as you said, that there's going to be some better answers for that than what we had.
Hopefully I will have
weeks
worked through some of these functions in my code library and find out which ones work really well in that environment, which one don't. The one that I'm not really comfortable with runs a DAO record set, and that seems to take quite a bit longer. And again, I don't know if that's because I'm not using tool correctly or if it's just inherent in the environment. So, but I found some other things that are really slick about it. So I'm gradually working towards that end. Okay, so on that note, if there's anybody else that would like to be on the mailing list, just drop your email into the chat. And otherwise, I thank everybody for joining us. I will let Juan's staff know that the video will be up and ready to go. It takes them a few days, in my experience, maybe a week, sometimes as long as 2 weeks to get them prepared and up, available on YouTube. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, George.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Mike. That was great.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Mike, George. Hey, Kev.
And thanks, David.
Okay, thank you.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
See you guys next time.